Imagine you are standing in a hostel in Reykjavik, not in a museum, not in a bank vault, but in a place meant for travelers who come and go without thinking too hard about history. In front of you sits a cheeseburger and a small pile of fries. They are sealed behind glass. They are not decorative. They are not ironic. They are a warning. This is the last McDonald's burger ever sold in Iceland. Purchased on October 30th, 2009. The day after, McDonald's, one of the most efficient, globalized corporations ever built, looked at Iceland's economy and quietly admitted defeat. The numbers no longer worked. The currency had collapsed so violently that importing an onion cost more than the burger itself. So they left. This is not a story about fast food. It is a story about what happens when a modern economy loses its anchor. In 2008, Iceland did not experience a normal recession. It engineered the largest banking collapse relative to the size of an economy in recorded history. The country didn't just go bankrupt, immolated its national balance sheet in full view of the world. Then, against all expectations, it survived. It jailed bankers. It let banks fail. It refused to obey the usual rules. And for a while, it looked like Iceland had cracked the code, like it had discovered a forbidden exit from the maze of global finance. But history has a cruel sense of symmetry. It is now 2024. The ground beneath Iceland is literally tearing itself apart. Lava flows creep toward towns. Entire communities are evacuated. The tourism industry, the very machine that powered Iceland's miraculous recovery, is choking on ash and uncertainty. Inflation is eroding wages. Interest rates are crushing households. The central bank is back in emergency mode, once again staring down forces far larger than itself. Iceland is not unlucky. Iceland is something more dangerous. It is an adrenaline junkie economy. It does not drift into crises. It sprints toward them. It oscillates between euphoria and collapse faster than most nations can finish a policy debate. One decade, it is hailed as a model for the future of capitalism. The next, it is used as a cautionary tale in economics textbooks. And that raises a deeply uncomfortable question. How does a tiny island of roughly 380,000 people, about the population of Wichita, Kansas, keep finding itself at the edge of global financial disaster? How does a nation built on fish, glaciers, and geothermal vents repeatedly threaten the stability of systems far larger than itself? To understand how Iceland broke the global banking system in 2008, and why it now finds itself skating toward another crisis, you have to understand how boring Iceland used to be. If you lived in Iceland in the 1980s or early 1990s, your economic identity was simple and brutally honest. Codfish was not an industry, was the nation's backbone, its culture, its rhythm of life. 70 to 80% of exports came from fishing. The economy followed a predictable loop. Go to sea, catch fish, export fish, import goods, repeat. It was stable. It was resilient, and most importantly, it was dull. But stability has a hidden weakness. It breeds impatience. At the turn of the millennium, Iceland's political and business elite looked outward and felt left behind. They watched London and New York turn finance into spectacle. They watched money multiply not through labor or production, but through leverage, derivatives, and speed. And they asked a fatal question. Why are we freezing our hands on fishing nets when we could be moving decimals on a screen? Between 2002 and 2003, Iceland made a decision that would redefine its fate. It privatized its banking sector. 3 major banks rose from the process, institutions that would soon become household names for all the wrong reasons. They were no longer conservative national utilities. They were aggressive, ambitious, and run by a new generation of executives who saw themselves not as caretakers of savings, but as conquerors of capital. These bankers understood something subtle but powerful about Iceland's position in the global system. The country was part of the European Economic Area, which allowed money to flow freely across borders. But Iceland kept its own currency, and its interest rates were high. This created an irresistible financial loophole. The strategy was deceptively simple. Borrow vast sums of cheap money from abroad, Europe, the United States, anywhere capital was abundant and interest rates were low. Then deploy that money aggressively, both at home and internationally, chasing higher returns. It was leverage on an epic scale, fueled by confidence and enabled by trust. And for a while, it worked. Icelandic banks didn't just lend to fishermen or local businesses. They went shopping. They bought iconic retailers, luxury brands, airlines, and sports teams. A nation that had once measured success by the size of its fishing quota was now measuring it by the size of its balance sheets. Wealth poured in. Living standards soared. Credit was cheap. Risk felt distant, abstract, almost theoretical. By the mid-2000s, Iceland had quietly transformed itself. It was no longer a country with a banking system. It was a banking system with a country attached. And that distinction matters. Because when finance grows faster than the real economy that supports it, something fragile forms beneath the surface. Growth becomes dependent on confidence. Confidence becomes dependent on continuous expansion. And expansion becomes dependent on borrowing more tomorrow than you borrowed today. It is at this point, right before the illusion fractures, that every great financial story begins to feel invincible. The burgers are still being imported. The shelves are still stocked. The credit cards still swipe. But the math, quietly, has already started to fail. By 2007, Iceland was flying higher than its fundamentals could ever justify. The numbers looked impressive, but they told the wrong story. The three newly privatized banks had expanded so aggressively that their combined assets had swollen to nearly 10 times the country's total GDP. That figure alone should have set off alarms across every regulatory agency in Europe. Instead, it was treated as proof of brilliance. Iceland wasn't small anymore, they said. It was smart, but leverage does not care about national pride. The illusion rested on a fragile mechanism known to finance insiders as the carry trade. Iceland's banks borrowed in foreign currencies, euros, Swiss francs, Japanese yen where interest rates were low. They then converted that money into Icelandic krona, where interest rates were much higher, pocketing the difference. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was lethal. Because the moment the krona weakened, every foreign currency loan exploded in value. This wasn't just happening inside boardrooms. It trickled down into everyday life. Ordinary Icelanders began taking out mortgages denominated in Swiss francs and Japanese yen. Taxi drivers debated exchange rates. Barbers talked about arbitrage. When a society reaches the point where everyone believes they have outsmarted risk, the bubble is already mature. What made Iceland especially vulnerable was scale. The Central Bank of Iceland simply did not have the foreign currency reserves needed to act as a lender of last resort. Its vault could cover imports for a few months. Meanwhile, the banks owed tens of billions in short-term foreign debt. They were rolling over loans constantly, dependent on global markets staying calm, liquid, and generous. And in 2008, global markets did the opposite. The collapse of Lehman Brothers was not just an American event. It was a planetary shockwave. Overnight, trust evaporated. Interbank lending froze. Institutions stopped asking who was profitable and started asking who would survive the week. For Iceland's banks, whose business model depended entirely on continuous refinancing, this was catastrophic. The first domino fell quickly. One of the major banks approached the Icelandic Central Bank for emergency support. The government looked at the balance sheet and realized the truth. The bank was too big to save and too big to exist. Nationalizing it would bankrupt the country outright. But letting it fall would trigger panic. They hesitated. Markets did not. Depositors across Europe began to run. This is where the story turns from financial excess into geopolitical nightmare. One bank, desperate for funding in the years leading up to the crash, had launched an online savings product abroad. The pitch was irresistible. Interest rates far higher than anything offered by British or Dutch banks. Backed at least in theory, by Iceland's regulatory framework. Hundreds of thousands of people, from municipalities to charities to private citizens, poured their savings into it. But deposit insurance is only as strong as the state behind it. When the run began, Iceland's deposit insurance fund was exposed as a fiction. It held nowhere near enough money to cover foreign claims. Faced with the impossible, the government made a brutal decision. Domestic deposits would be protected. Foreign ones would not, at least not immediately. To Iceland, this was triage. To the United Kingdom, it was an act of betrayal. On October 8, 2008, The British government responded with an act so extreme it still feels surreal. Prime Minister Gordon Brown invoked anti-terrorism legislation laws written to combat organizations like Al-Qaeda to freeze the assets of Icelandic banks and the Icelandic state. Overnight, Iceland found itself listed alongside rogue regimes and terror networks. The consequences were instant and devastating. Credit cards issued by Icelandic banks stopped working globally. Imports halted. Ships carrying food and medicine turned around mid-journey. Businesses couldn't pay suppliers. Families abroad found themselves stranded, unable to access money. The krona didn't decline, it vaporized, losing roughly half its value in a matter of days. When trading resumed on Iceland's stock exchange, the market collapsed by over 90%. Entire fortunes disappeared. Pension funds were wiped out. The country was effectively insolvent. Inflation surged. Interest rates were hiked to punishing levels in a desperate attempt to stabilize the currency. Households that had borrowed in foreign currencies watched their debts double almost overnight. A mortgage that was manageable on Monday became impossible by Friday. People owed more than their homes were worth in a market that no longer functioned. This was not an abstract crisis. It was intimate. It arrived in kitchens, in living rooms, in whispered conversations between couples trying to figure out whether they could still afford heat. Iceland had reached the point every leveraged system eventually reaches, the moment when private risk becomes public pain. And yet, something unusual happened next. While governments elsewhere scrambled to rescue banks at any cost, while trillions were conjured into existence to preserve financial institutions deemed too big to fail, Icelandic citizens did not beg for stability. They demanded accountability. They didn't riot. They didn't burn buildings. They brought pots and pans. The collapse had crossed a psychological threshold. This was no longer about economics. It was about trust, about the social contract between a nation and those who claimed to manage its future. And when that contract broke, Iceland's response was not resignation. It was rebellion. When a society is pushed far enough, it doesn't always explode. Sometimes it resonates. In the winter of 2008-2009, that resonance echoed through Sturvlar Square, the open space in front of Iceland's parliament. Normally, Icelanders are famously restrained. They value quiet consensus. They queue politely. But something had snapped. Savings were gone. Mortgages had doubled. The country's name had been dragged through international disgrace. So they went to the kitchen. Every Saturday, thousands of citizens, at times nearly 3% of the entire population, surrounded Parliament, banging pots, pans, ladles, and frying skillets together in a deafening wall of sound. It was impossible to ignore. Politicians inside couldn't hear themselves think. Bonfires were lit. Eggs and toilet paper flew. The protests were loud, relentless, and deeply symbolic. This wasn't chaos. It was judgment. History would call it the kitchenware revolution. And it worked. By January 2009, the government collapsed. It was the first time in modern history that a democratic government fell not to violence, but to sustained civic fury expressed through noise. A new coalition took power, inheriting a nation in ruins and an impossible dilemma. Foreign governments, particularly the UK and the Netherlands, demanded repayment for the losses suffered by their citizens. The bill was staggering. Nearly €4 billion, equivalent to roughly €12,000 per Icelandic man, woman, and child. For most countries, the decision would have been automatic. Pay, restore credibility, move on. Iceland hesitated. The new government initially agreed to a repayment deal, desperate to normalize relations and re-enter global markets. Parliament passed the law, and then something extraordinary happened. The President of Iceland, normally a ceremonial figure, refused to sign it. He sent the question to a national referendum. He handed the decision back to the people. The international response was furious. The IMF threatened to withhold aid. Credit rating agencies downgraded Iceland to junk status. Diplomats warned of isolation. The pressure was immense. The vote came in March 2010. The question was simple. Should Iceland's taxpayers repay private banking debts incurred abroad? 93% voted no. It was an act of defiance, almost without precedent. A tiny nation looked at the machinery of global finance and declined to comply. A second referendum followed a year later on revised terms. Again, the answer was no. Iceland had drawn a line. Banks were private. Their failures would remain private. But refusal alone was not a recovery strategy. What followed was one of the most radical economic experiments in modern history. Instead of rescuing failed banks, Iceland dismantled them. The government split the institutions into good and bad banks. Domestic deposits and functioning loans were transferred into new banks, recapitalized to keep the economy running. The old banks, stuffed with foreign debt and toxic assets, were left to collapse. Foreign creditors took losses. Many took pennies on the dollar. To prevent capital flight, Iceland imposed strict capital controls. Money could not freely leave the country. Exporters were required to convert foreign earnings into krona. For a Western democracy, this was heresy. Capital controls were supposed to be relics of failed states, but Iceland used them as a tourniquet, painful, constricting, but life-saving. Because it didn't pour its resources into bank bailouts, the state retained enough capacity to protect its social fabric. Welfare programs survived. The poorest citizens were shielded from the worst effects of inflation. The economy contracted sharply, but it did not disintegrate. By 2011, growth returned. By 2012, Iceland was repaying the IMF early. International commentators marveled at the Icelandic miracle. Economists praised the courage to let banks fail. More than 24 bankers were convicted. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Iceland had proven that another path was possible, that capitalism could fail without dragging democracy down with it. But recovery does not come from policy alone. It also comes from coincidence. In 2010, a volcano erupted with a name that defied pronunciation and grammar alike. Ash filled the sky. European air traffic shut down. Airlines lost billions. And Iceland, accidentally, received the greatest marketing campaign in its history. The world discovered Iceland. What followed was a transformation not just of the economy, but of the island itself. Tourism surged. Hollywood arrived. Music videos, blockbuster films, fantasy epics all used Iceland's raw landscapes as their canvas. Visitors poured in, dollars and euros flowing where krona once collapsed. Tourism replaced finance as the engine of growth. It felt safer, more tangible, less abstract. But bubbles do not care what industry they form in. They care only about momentum. And once again, Iceland was accelerating. By the mid-2010s, Iceland was no longer a financial pariah. It was fashionable. What the banks once promised with spreadsheets and leverage, tourism now delivered with glaciers and lava fields. Foreign currency flooded back into the country, not through derivatives, but through hotel bookings, rental cars, wool sweaters, and outrageously expensive beer. The numbers were astonishing. In 2010, fewer than 500,000 tourists visited Iceland. By 2018, more than 2.3 million arrived every year, nearly 7 times the country's population. To grasp the scale, imagine the United States hosting 2 billion tourists annually. The influx solved one problem instantly: foreign currency. The krona stabilized. Banks refilled with euros and dollars. Employment surged. Unemployment fell so low that Iceland ran out of workers and began importing labor. For a while, it felt like redemption. Tourism overtook fishing and aluminum smelting to become Iceland's largest export sector, accounting for over 40% of export revenues. Reykjavik transformed. Cranes dotted the skyline. Hotels rose where modest apartments once stood, cafes multiplied. Streets once quiet became global crossroads of accents and backpacks. But beneath the prosperity, the same pattern was quietly re-emerging. Real estate prices surged. Airbnb hollowed out residential neighborhoods. Young Icelanders, many of them children during the kitchenware revolution, found themselves priced out of the city they had protested to save. Rent doubled, then tripled. What had once been a housing market became an asset class, optimized for short-term visitors. By Arling ET, Reykjavik felt less like a capital and more like a permanent hotel lobby. Souvenir shops replaced grocery stores. Puffin plushies replaced pharmacies. The economy was growing, but it was narrowing. Economists have a name for this: Dutch disease. When one dominant sector pulls in foreign money, it drives up the currency and labor costs. slowly suffocating every other industry. Manufacturing becomes uncompetitive. Exports struggle. Diversification dies quietly. The central bank, watching inflation creep upward, did what central banks always do. It raised interest rates. Mortgages became heavier. Household debt climbed again. The rhythm felt uncomfortably familiar. Then came the warning shot. In 2019, WOW Air, the ultra-low-cost airline that had served as Iceland's tourism artery, collapsed overnight. Flights vanished. Visitor numbers dropped. GDP contracted. The krona weakened. It wasn't a collapse, but it was a reminder. The miracle depended on cheap flights and constant motion. And then, in 2020, the world stopped. For an economy where roughly 40% of export revenue depended on people boarding airplanes, the pandemic was devastating. Unemployment surged to levels rivaling the banking collapse. The government intervened with stimulus and support. Iceland endured. Once again, resilience became part of the national myth. By 2022, tourists returned. The cycle resumed. And then the Earth itself intervened, beginning in late 2023. Volcanic systems beneath the Rock Janes Peninsula, for nearly 8 centuries, awoke violently. This was not a distant eruption under ice. This was lava tearing through the outskirts of Reykjavik's infrastructure. Entire towns were evacuated. Homes were swallowed. Power plants and tourist landmarks sat behind hastily built walls of gravel. The Blue Lagoon, one of Iceland's most profitable attractions, closed repeatedly. Roads cracked. Booking cancellations surged. Investors hesitated. Nature had turned from marketing asset into existential risk. And alongside the lava came inflation again, hovering near double digits. Interest rates climbed above 9%. Mortgage payments crushed households. Strikes paralyzed industries as workers demanded wages that could keep up with the cost of living. The symptoms mirrored 2007 almost perfectly. Overheating, inflation, rising rates. Social tension, different engine. Same trajectory. Iceland had replaced one extreme dependency with another. Finance had been swapped for tourism. Leverage for visitors, derivatives for destinations. But the underlying flaw remained: concentration. The island had not learned how to grow steadily. It had learned how to recover spectacularly and then gamble again. At the root of Iceland's recurring crises lies a mechanical truth most countries never have to confront so directly. Iceland is the smallest nation on Earth to operate a fully independent, freely floating currency with its own monetary policy. A population smaller than many suburban school districts is running a currency that trades on the same global markets as the US dollar and the euro. That creates a permanent roller coaster. When times are good, foreign money floods in. The krona strengthens. Imports become cheaper. Icelanders feel rich. They travel, they borrow, they build. But when confidence cracks even slightly, the currency collapses with breathtaking speed. Imports spike in price. Inflation erupts. The central bank panics and hikes interest rates to levels that would cause riots in larger economies. Right now, Icelandic households face mortgage rates above 10%. In much of Europe, those same loans cost 3 or 4%. That difference is the price of monetary sovereignty. It is also the tax of volatility. There is a standing debate in Iceland that never quite resolves. Should the country join the European Union and adopt the euro? The math is tempting. Lower interest rates, currency stability. Easier trade, fewer crises. But the political cost is existential. It would mean surrendering control. It would mean taking orders from Brussels. And if there is one thing Icelandic history makes clear, it is that independence, economic, political, cultural, is not negotiable. So Iceland stays on the ride. And that brings us back to the cheeseburger behind glass. That burger has not decayed in over 15 years. It has hardened, preserved, refusing to change. In its own way, it is the perfect symbol of Iceland itself. A country that absorbs catastrophe, adapts, and keeps moving forward, sometimes wiser, sometimes not. Iceland proved something the world is still too afraid to admit. You can let banks fail. You can jail the people responsible. You can defy financial orthodoxy and survive. But Iceland also proved the other half of the equation. You cannot cheat gravity. Not financial gravity, not geological gravity, not forever. Whether the engine is investment banking or Instagram tourism, building an economy on fast money and narrow foundations always ends the same way. Eventually, the bill arrives. Sometimes it comes as a banking collapse. Sometimes it comes as inflation. Sometimes it comes as lava pouring through a town. Most nations need wars or dictators to ruin themselves twice in a generation. Iceland managed it with fish, financial engineering, celebrity tourism, and a tectonic plate. And yet they are still standing. They are still there, covered in ash, paying too much for beer, arguing about interest rates, and watching the ground beneath them crack. And when the lava cools, you can be almost certain of one thing. They'll find a new way to gamble everything again.